Thirst does strange things to perfectly decent people. When neighborhood taps sputtered and spat dry dust, Oakhaven's manicured lawns turned to brittle ash. Only one man had prepared for the devastating 90-day drought. He built an ugly, sprawling rainwater trap that everyone mocked until his property became the only oasis left. Harrison Caldwell did not look like a doomsday prepper. He was a retired structural engineer with a quiet demeanor, a penchant for khaki shorts, and a meticulous way of speaking. But when he hired an earth-moving crew in the second week of March to rip up his pristine, half-acre backyard in the affluent, unincorporated suburb of Oakhaven, Texas, people started to talk. Oakhaven was a place defined by its lush, emerald-green lawns, imported Japanese maples, and a strict homeowners association that dictated everything from the color of mailboxes to the height of front yard hedges. So, when a massive yellow backhoe began carving a pit 30 feet wide and 12 feet deep into Harrison's property, Greg Peterson, the notoriously rigid HOA president, nearly had a stroke. Greg marched across the street, his face flushed red beneath his designer sunglasses, clipboard in hand. He demanded to know if Harrison was building an unapproved swimming pool. Harrison simply adjusted his glasses, wiped a smear of dirt from his forehead, and pointed to 3 massive, black, ribbed polyethylene cisterns sitting on a flatbed trailer in his driveway. Each one was capable of holding 10,000 gallons of water. "Not a pool, Greg," Harrison replied calmly. "A closed-loop catchment system. I'm taking my property entirely off the municipal grid." The neighborhood reaction was immediate and relentless. Brenda Sterling, who lived 2 doors down and hosted the community's weekly garden club, loudly complained that the massive tanks looked like industrial waste containers. Before the crew could bury them, she circulated a petition to halt the construction, claiming the monstrosity was tanking local property values. Kyle Dempsey, a 26-year-old tech millionaire who had recently bought the mansion next door, found the whole ordeal hilarious. Kyle frequently stood on his upper deck balcony, sipping imported espresso, taking videos of Harrison working in the Texas sun. He posted them to his social media with captions like, "My neighbor thinks Noah's flood is coming. Someone get this guy a mental health check." But Harrison ignored the snickers, the passive-aggressive HOA violation notices stuffed in his mailbox, and the outright hostility. He worked methodically. After burying the massive tanks, he installed a complex network of corrugated metal roofing over his patio and garage, all angled with mathematical precision to maximize runoff. He fitted the gutters with leaf eaters and first flush diverters devices designed to catch the initial, dust-laden rainfall and flush it away, ensuring only pristine water entered the main cisterns. Down in his basement, he wired a multi-stage filtration system featuring micron sediment filters, activated carbon blocks, and a heavy-duty ultraviolet sterilization lamp. By late April, the system was fully operational. It was an engineering marvel, though admittedly an eyesore. The sleek, modern lines of Harrison's suburban home were now dominated by thick, white PVC pipes, running down the exterior walls and strange, industrial-looking metal flumes. Then came the freak storm of early May. It was a strange, unseasonal weather event. For 4 straight days, the sky opened up, dumping nearly 14 inches of rain onto Oakhaven. It was a torrential, relentless deluge. Flash flood warnings blared on every television and smartphone. While Greg Peterson was busy frantically sandbagging his basement windows and Brenda Sterling wept over her drowned prize-winning petunias, Harrison Caldwell stood on his back porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the glorious, rushing sound of water being swallowed by his property. His system worked flawlessly. Every drop that hit his roof was captured, filtered, and funneled deep underground. By the time the storm broke, leaving the neighborhood waterlogged and steaming in the returning sun, Harrison's subterranean tanks were at maximum capacity, 30,000 gallons of cold, clean water safely stored in the dark earth, immune to evaporation. The storm passed. The clouds parted. And then, it simply never rained again. By late June, Oakhaven was baking under a merciless high-pressure heat dome. The temperature regularly crested at 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity vanished, replaced by a searing, dry wind that felt like the exhaust of a jet engine. At first, life carried on. The residents of Oakhaven were used to hot Texas summers. Sprinkler systems clicked on at dawn, painting the neighborhood in artificial rain. Kyle Dempsey washed his fleet of sports cars in his driveway every weekend, letting thousands of gallons of municipal water run straight into the storm drains. But behind the scenes, a localized crisis was brewing. Oak Haven was not connected to a major city's water infrastructure. It relied on Lake Benedict, a regional reservoir, and a series of deep municipal wells. The freak storm in May had primarily hit the suburbs, bypassing the watershed that fed the reservoir. 30 days into the dry spell, the first notices arrived in the mail. Level 1 water restrictions. Residents were asked to water their lawns only twice a week. Greg Peterson ignored it. He quietly adjusted his automated sprinklers to run at 2:00 a.m., assuming no one would notice. Brenda Sterling continued to soak her extensive rose garden twice a day, terrified the heat would kill her expensive bloom. Hubris ran deep in Oak Haven. These were wealthy people who believed their tax dollars bought them immunity from nature. 60 days into the drought, the situation turned critical. Lake Benedict dropped past its secondary intake pipes. The municipal wells, severely overdrawn by the surrounding agricultural developments, began to suck mud. The city council held an emergency meeting and instituted immediate, draconian measures. Outdoor watering was strictly banned. Car washing was outlawed. Fines for violations jumped to $1,000 per offense. Almost overnight, the illusion of suburban paradise shattered. Without their daily soakings, the vibrant green lawns of Oak Haven flash-dried into brittle, brown straw. Trees began dropping their leaves in July to conserve moisture. The soil contracted, cracking open in deep, jagged fissures that tore at the foundations of the expensive home. By day 75, the real nightmare began. The municipal water pressure dropped to a trickle. When residents turned on their faucets, the water that came out was heavily chlorinated, cloudy, and sometimes tinged with an alarming rusty brown hue. Then came the rolling shutoffs. To preserve what little water remained for emergency fire services, the county utility board shut off residential water flow for 18 hours a day. Oak Haven residents only had water between 4:00 a.m. and 10:00 a.m. Panic hit the local supermarkets. The bottled water aisle at the nearby grocery store was stripped bare within hours. Fights broke out over cases of generic spring water. Kyle Dempsey was spotted shouting at a teenage cashier because the store limited purchases to 2 gallons per household. Greg Peterson tried to organize a neighborhood coalition to demand the county truck in water tankers, but the county was too overwhelmed dealing with hospitals and nursing homes to care about Oak Haven's dry pipes. Through all this suffering, Harrison Caldwell's property remained an anomaly. Because his water was stored underground, keeping it cool and preventing algae growth, and because he ran it through his UV filters, he had zero reliance on the failing municipal grid. While the rest of the neighborhood smelled of dry dust and wilted vegetation, Harrison's small backyard greenhouse was thriving. He didn't waste water on his lawn. He let the grass die like everyone else's, but he took normal showers. He washed his dishes. He drank glasses of crystal clear, ice-cold water while sitting on his porch in the evening. The contrast became impossible to ignore. One sweltering evening in early August, with the temperature still hovering at 98 degrees past sunset, Greg Peterson's air conditioning unit seized up. The coils had frozen and burned out due to the relentless strain. Sweating profusely, desperate, and covered in a rash from 3 days without a proper shower, Greg wandered out onto his dead lawn to try and catch a breeze. He looked across the street. The neighborhood was dead quiet, save for the hum of cicadas. There was no water running in the gutters. There were no sprinklers hissing. But from Harrison Caldwell's open kitchen window, Greg heard a sound that made his parched throat spasm. It was the distinct, heavy sound of a kitchen faucet running at full pressure. It wasn't sputtering. It wasn't coughing air. It was a steady, powerful stream of water hitting a metal sink. Greg crossed the street like a man in a trance. He crept up to Harrison's side yard, staying in the shadows. He peeked over the wooden fence. Harrison was standing at an outdoor utility sink connected to his home's plumbing. He was casually washing dirt off a bundle of fresh, bright green carrots he had just pulled from his greenhouse. The water cascaded over the vegetables, pooling in the basin before draining away. Greg stared at the water. His mouth was so dry his tongue felt like sandpaper. He remembered the petition. He remembered the jokes, the mockery, the HOA fines he had personally signed and delivered. He realized then that the eccentric engineer they had all ostracized was sitting on a private, 30,000-gallon gold mine. And as the drought tightened its grip into its third brutal month, Greg knew that polite suburban rules were about to evaporate completely. Gossip in Oakhaven had historically revolved around property lines, unapproved paint swatches, and infidelity. By the second week of August Day, 81 of the relentless drought gossip became a matter of physical survival. Greg Peterson could not keep his discovery quiet. The image of Harrison Caldwell casually washing dirt off garden-fresh carrots, while the rest of the neighborhood rationed half-liter bottles of murky, boiled tap water burned in Greg's mind. Within 48 hours, every resident on the block knew that the doomsday rainwater trap they had mocked was currently holding an ocean of pristine water. The shift in the neighborhood's psychological state was immediate and terrifying. The veneer of polite, upper-middle-class society dissolved. Desperation has a specific smell, a metallic, sour tang, and it hung heavily in the dead, windless air of Oakhaven. It started with polite, albeit strained, requests. Brenda Sterling was the first. She walked up Harrison's driveway, her normally perfectly coiffed hair stringy and flat, clutching a plastic gallon jug. She knocked on the heavy oak front door, her hands trembling. Harrison answered, looking remarkably composed in clean clothes. "Harrison," Brenda started, her voice cracking. "My husband's kidneys. He's prone to stones. The municipal water, even when we boil it, it's so heavy with particulate matter. Could we just have a gallon? Just one." Harrison looked at the jug, then at Brenda's sunken eyes. He was a man of science, but he was not devoid of empathy. He took the jug, walked to his kitchen, filled it from his heavily filtered tap, and handed it back. "1 gallon, Brenda," Harrison said, his voice low and serious. "Make it last." But Brenda's quiet success was the match that ignited the powder keg. By the next afternoon, a line of 6 people stood at Harrison's property line, holding an assortment of buckets, pitchers, and sports coolers. Greg Peterson stood at the front, flanked by David and Chloe Barrett, a young couple who looked frantic, holding their lethargic 6-month-old baby. Harrison stepped out onto his porch. "Harrison, we need to talk about resource sharing," Greg began, trying to summon the authority he wielded as HOA president, though his cracked lips and unwashed clothes undermined his commanding tone. "We know you have tens of thousands of gallons buried back there. It's a community emergency. You have a moral obligation to open your taps to the neighborhood." Kyle Dempsey, the tech millionaire, pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He looked unhinged. He was holding a leather briefcase. "Skip the communist sharing crap, Greg," Kyle barked. He looked at Harrison. "Caldwell, I have $50,000 in cash in this case. I want a hose run from your tanks to my property. Now. I haven't showered in a week, and my toilets won't flush. Name your price." Harrison looked down at the desperate faces, his expression unreadable. He walked down the porch steps and stopped at the wrought iron gate, separating him from the crowd. "Listen to me very carefully," Harrison said, his voice cutting through the humid, suffocating air. "I do not have an infinite supply. I have exactly 28,400 gallons remaining. If I open the taps to the 40 households in this subdivision so you can flush your toilets and wash your hair, this system will run dry in less than 12 days. And the weather models show no rain for at least another 3 weeks. "You're hoarding it," a voice shouted from the back. "I am managing it," Harrison corrected sharply. He pointed a finger at Kyle. "Your money is worthless right now, Kyle. You can't drink $50 bills. If I sell you a hose to waste on your luxury, people on this street will die of dehydration by September." Harrison's eyes softened as he looked at the Barretts. "I will not let anyone die, but I will not enable your previous lifestyles. I am setting up a rationing station, 1 gallon per person per day, for drinking and cooking only. No flushing, no washing cars, no watering rose bushes, and you will only get it if you surrender your municipal intake valves, so nobody cross-contaminates my clean supply." The crowd erupted into angry murmurs. The audacity of this man, the man they had mocked, petitioned against, and harassed dictating terms to them, was a bitter pill to swallow. "You don't own the water, Caldwell," Kyle screamed, slamming his briefcase against the iron gate. "It fell from the sky. It belongs to the county." "The county didn't build the catchment system, Kyle." "I did," Harrison replied calmly. "Take the ration, or leave my property. Those are your only options." Most of the neighbors, broken and exhausted, accepted the terms. They lined up in the scorching heat, presenting their containers, swallowing their pride, as Harrison meticulously measured out their daily survival. But resentment is a dangerous seed, and in the blistering heat of Oakhaven, it was germinating rapidly. The true breaking point arrived on day 88. Harrison knew the structural integrity of his tanks was sound, but he also knew the fragility of human morality. He had installed motion sensor floodlights and cheap, battery-powered security cameras around the perimeter of his backyard. At 2:15 a.m., the alarm on his nightstand buzzed. Harrison sat up, grabbed a heavy-duty tactical flashlight, and checked his tablet. The infrared camera feed showed 3 figures moving near the side fence, carrying a heavy, gas-powered transfer pump and thick industrial hoses. It was Kyle Dempsey, along with 2 men Harrison didn't recognize, likely private security or hired hands Kyle had brought in from outside the neighborhood. They were preparing to breach the fence, drop a hose directly into the primary access hatch of the underground cistern, and siphon thousands of gallons of water away in the dead of night. Harrison didn't call the police. The emergency dispatch lines had been busy for weeks, overwhelmed by heat-stroke calls and looting in the commercial districts. Instead, Harrison walked to his basement utility room. He bypassed the main drinking water lines and approached a secondary manifold, a system he had built to handle the gray water, the unpurified runoff used strictly for emergency fire suppression. He gripped the heavy red lever of the main pressure valve. As he heard the metallic screech of his backyard gate being pried open with a crowbar, Harrison engaged the system. Outside, Kyle and his hired men crept toward the buried tanks. "Just get the hatch open," Kyle whispered frantically. "Drop the line in. We take 10,000 gallons and get out." Suddenly, the night erupted in blinding white light as the floodlights flared. Before Kyle could react, the high-pressure irrigation cannons hidden in the landscaping sprang to life, but they didn't shoot a light mist. Powered by a massive commercial sump pump, the cannons blasted a solid 60 psi stream of stagnant, foul-smelling gray water directly at the intruders. It hit Kyle square in the chest, knocking him backward into the dead, thorny rose bushes. His hired men dropped the heavy pump, slipping and sliding in the sudden foul mud, scrambling blindly over the fence to escape the deluge. Harrison stepped out onto his back porch, the heavy tactical flashlight illuminating Kyle, who was sputtering, covered in mud, and tangled in thorn. "I told you, Kyle," Harrison called out into the night, his voice devoid of anger, echoing with a chilling calmness. "The engineering is sound. Do not test it again." The morning after the attempted theft, a profound, suffocating silence fell over Oakhaven. Kyle Dempsey did not show his face. His expensive, gas-powered transfer pump remained abandoned in Harrison Caldwell's side yard, half buried in the foul-smelling mud created by the graywater defense cannons. The grim reality of their situation had finally pierced the thick, insulated bubble of suburban entitlement. The municipal pipes had now been completely dry for 4 agonizing days. Radios broadcasted bleak updates. County water trucks had stopped coming to their sector entirely, prioritizing inner-city hospitals, nursing homes, and state penitentiaries. Oakhaven was officially on its own. If Harrison's system failed, or if he decided to lock his wrought iron gates for good, the residents would be forced to abandon their million-dollar homes and join the swelling ranks of climate refugees fleeing the county. By day 91, the localized heat dome tightened like a vice. The temperature peaked at a staggering 108 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. The asphalt on the roads became soft and sticky, trapping dust and dead leaves. Small songbirds, completely dehydrated, fell dead from the brittle branches of the withering oak trees, littering the manicured sidewalks. Inside the stifling, oven-like houses, hardwood floors warped and drywall cracked under the severe lack of humidity. At 3:15 p.m., a high-pitched, panicked scream shattered the heavy, windless afternoon. The sound tore out from Brenda Sterling's house. Greg Peterson, who had been sitting motionless on his shaded porch, staring blankly at the hazy sky, bolted across the street. Harrison, hearing the commotion through his open windows, immediately grabbed a heavy trauma kit and sprinted out the door. They found Brenda collapsed in her front hallway. Her skin was flushed, a dangerous, mottled crimson, completely dry and radiating intense, frightening heat. She was unresponsive. Her eyes rolled back, and her breathing was horribly shallow and rapid. Heat stroke, Harrison diagnosed instantly, dropping to his knees and checking her thready pulse. Her core temperature's critical. Greg, we have to cool her down this very second, or her internal organs will start cooking themselves. She's going into failure. How? Greg shrieked, panic contorting his sunburned face, tears cutting clean tracks through the thick layer of dust on his cheeks. We don't have a single cube of ice. The power grids are doing rolling brownouts. My refrigerator is dead. We don't have any water left, Harrison. I do, Harrison said, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. He didn't hesitate to break his own strict rationing rules. He looked sharply at Greg. Go to my backyard. Uncoil the thick green garden hose attached to the side of the greenhouse. Run it straight through her front door. Do not stop for anything. Move. Greg ran faster than he had in 3 decades, his lungs burning. Minutes later, he dragged the heavy, brass-tipped hose over Brenda's expensive Persian rugs. Harrison had sprinted back to his basement utility room, his fingers flying across the control panel. He overrode the daily rationing limiters, bypassed the slow-flow valves, and activated the main, heavy-duty commercial pump, sending a massive surge of cold, subterranean water straight into the line. They soaked Brenda right there on her hardwood floors. The ice-cold 50-degree water shocked her overheated system. Harrison continuously monitored her pulse, his hand pressed firmly against her neck, while Greg kept the water flowing over her torso and legs, weeping openly as the precious liquid pooled around them and seeped into the baseboards. Slowly, agonizingly, the terrifying crimson flush faded from Brenda's skin. Her eyelids fluttered, and she took a deep, ragged breath. The immediate, lethal threat receded, washed away by the one resource money could no longer buy. That evening, as dusk offered a slight reprieve from the baking sun, the neighborhood gathered in the middle of the street. There was no anger left. There was no entitlement, no talk of property values, and no threats of lawsuits. There was only profound, humbling, exhausting gratitude. Harrison stood before them, looking deeply tired but resolute. We are in the absolute worst of it, he told the silent, dirty crowd. The grid is failing, and the sky is empty, but we are not going to die. I am opening the secondary, purified tank. We are setting up a triage center in my basement. It's insulated, and the ambient temperature stays around 65 degrees down there. Anyone who is vulnerable, David and Chloe's baby, the elderly, anyone feeling dizzy sleeps down there starting tonight. We pool our remaining canned food. We share the water rations strictly under my supervision. We survive this together, but we do it with absolute, uncompromising discipline. Greg Peterson, the man who had gleefully written Harrison 3 separate citations for unapproved landscaping features, stepped forward. He didn't have his clipboard. He looked at Harrison, nodded slowly, and turned to the crowd. You heard him, Greg said, his voice cracking with emotion. Mr. Caldwell is in charge. Whatever he needs, whatever he says, we do it without question. For the next 5 days, Oakhaven operated not as a wealthy, disconnected suburb, but as a highly efficient, tightly knit survival cooperative. Kyle Dempsey emerged from his sprawling mansion on day 92. He didn't bring cash or threats. He dragged a heavy wagon loaded with a massive stockpile of military-grade MREs, meals ready to eat, that he had ordered online years ago as a joke. Without a single word of bravado, he handed the entire supply over to Harrison, taking his single, measured gallon of water in return, staring at his expensive shoes to avoid eye contact. They slept in organized shifts on the cool concrete floor of Harrison's basement. They monitored each other relentlessly for signs of lethargy or dehydration. Under Harrison's calm, methodical leadership, the frantic panic was replaced by a grim, focused determination. They watched the digital water level gauges on the black polyethylene tanks slowly drop, gallon by precious gallon, calculating their collective survival down to the final decimal point. And then, on the late afternoon of day 97, the atmospheric pressure violently shifted. The searing, dry wind that had tortured them for months suddenly stopped dead. The air grew impossibly heavy, thick, and suffocating, suddenly carrying a startling, unfamiliar scent, the sharp, metallic smell of ozone mixed with damp earth. Petrichor. Chloe Barrett, was the first to physically feel it. She was holding her sleeping baby on Harrison's shaded porch when a single, fat, freezing drop of water struck her forehead. She gasped, looking up. The sky, which had been a harsh, blinding, cloudless white-blue for 3 solid months, was deeply bruised. Dark, rolling charcoal and violent purple clouds were surging in from the northwest, swallowing the sun. The temperature plummeted 15 degrees in 20 minutes. A low, guttural rumble of thunder shook the ground, vibrating through the soles of their shoes and rattling the glass in the dry, brittle window frames. And then, the sky broke open. It wasn't a gentle, polite suburban shower. It was a torrential, violent, magnificent downpour. The rain slammed against the cracked earth, instantly turning the choking dust into thick brown mud. It hammered against the rooftops with a deafening roar. Front doors flew open all down the street. Greg Peterson walked out into the dead center of the road, dropping to his knees, letting the freezing rain soak through his filthy clothes, laughing hysterically at the churning sky. Kyle Dempsey stood on his upper balcony, both arms outstretched, his face turned upward, letting the water wash away his pride. Brenda Sterling wept uncontrollably on her front porch, clinging fiercely to her husband. Harrison Caldwell did not run into the street to celebrate. He walked quietly to his backyard. He stood under the protective, engineered awning of his patio and watched his complex system of corrugated metal roofs, angled gutters, and heavy flumes roar back to glorious life. The water rushed violently down the white PVC pipes. The mechanical first flush diverters caught the filthy, dust-heavy initial rain, efficiently spitting the toxic slurry into the yard. A few minutes later, the diverters sealed, and crystal-clear water began cascading into the primary underground tanks. The heavy, resonant, echoing sound of the massive cisterns filling up reverberated through the yard, the beautiful, mechanical, undeniable sound of survival. The brutal drought was broken. In time, the municipal water grid would slowly return to function. The lawns would eventually be replanted with new sod, and the neighborhood would try to rebuild its shattered facade of upscale normalcy. But Oak Haven was fundamentally, irreversibly changed. By the following spring, when the Homeowners Association held its annual meeting, Greg Peterson aggressively pushed through a sweeping set of new, unbreakable bylaws. Lush, water-heavy, imported lawns were permanently banned. Drought-resistant, native landscaping became strictly mandatory. And more importantly, there were never any more passive-aggressive complaints about Harrison Caldwell's yard. In fact, by the first week of April, 6 other massive, yellow backhoes were spotted digging deep, 30-foot holes in the backyards of Oak Haven's most expensive properties, as the humbled residents eagerly prepared to install their own ugly, beautiful rainwater trap. The story of Harrison Caldwell proves that true preparedness isn't about paranoia. It's about engineering a lifeline when society's fragile systems fail. Did Oak Haven's descent into chaos shock you? Or would your neighbors react the exact same way? If you found this real-life survival drama gripping, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories.